Class is officially back in session. We are debunking myths. We're going to address not one, not two, but three common myths associated with a hydraulic clutch. Greetings, fellow DIYer, and welcome to my video. So welcome to another exciting episode of Hydraulic Clutch 101. And when I say exciting, I mean exciting. I've seen these videos. I know that the material's kind of dry and, well, frankly, I'm not that funny. But that's okay. I've got over 20 years experience selling hydraulic clutch kits. I've designed 4 or 5 different kits for a wide variety of transmissions and cars. If you're interested in any of the products I sell, check out Days Cars. But you did not come here for an advertisement. You came here to learn something, and that's what we're going to do. So we are going to tackle the 3 common myths that are constantly coming up when I am doing tech support for customers on a hydraulic clutch like this. Now, our example mule for today is a T5 hydraulic clutch kit. This is the side mount version. It's got a 7/8 bore slave cylinder. It's got a spherical push rod. It's got this nice T-bracket that mounts to these side tabs on the T5. It's a very, very clean install. And this is the main unit that I have been selling for years. Now, again, I have kits that are flush mount that mount to the transmission tabs. I have TKX 3550, TKO. I even have brackets for 94 and up T5 transmission because the window is in a different spot. This is my good old standard T5 basic kit. So the 3 myths that we're going to address, like most good myths, are based in some little truth. Now, not all myths are based in truth, but the best ones, the ones that are most believable, have some nugget, some little piece of truth that makes the person believe it to be true. And as we go through and talk about the myths, we are going to talk about what it is about the myth that makes it true for the individual. The first myth that we are going to address is the most common thing that I hear from customers. They say, I'm not getting enough stroke at the slave cylinder, but I know all the air is out. And that's myth number 1. All the air is out. My question is always to ask them, how much stroke are you getting? And what master cylinder are you using? In some cases, they're using the wrong master cylinder, and that's why they're not getting enough stroke here at the slave cylinder. But more often than not, they've purchased the master cylinder that I sell. And I know for a fact that that master cylinder has the perfect amount of volume to work with the slave cylinder and give you the 1 inch required here at the slave cylinder. So I say to them, how much stroke are you getting? And they say, about 3/4 of an inch. And my answer, every time, there's air in the system. And immediately they argue with me. They say, I know how to bleed brakes. I've been working on cars and bleeding hydraulic systems for 50 years, and there is no air in my system. And I say, well, that may be true. I'm sure you're a very competent mechanic, but you can't use your experience with brakes on a hydraulic clutch. See, the difference, and this is the nugget of truth, this is what makes this myth so challenging for people. The truth is their experience is brakes. And brakes, it's easy to tell if there is air in the system, because if there's air in the system, the brakes feel spongy. On a hydraulic clutch, it doesn't feel spongy. There's no lag. Like on brakes, you'll start to push the pedal, and it'll take a second before the brakes start to grab. But on a hydraulic clutch, the second the pedal starts moving, the slave cylinder starts moving, even if there's air in the system. And so this is the truth that makes people think that they've got all the air out. So what's the difference? This is a hydraulic system. This is a hydraulic mechanism that through hydraulic pressure pushes something which is identical to what we're dealing with in brakes. There's a master cylinder, which again is identical to brakes. Why do the rules that apply to brakes not apply to this? And it's simple. And when you think about it, you understand that, okay, that makes sense. The pressure applied to stop a car, so the wheel cylinder in drum brakes or the piston in disc brakes, create line pressures that exceed 200 psi. I've heard of braking systems, especially with power brakes, that have 500 to 1,000 psi in the line. Now, hydraulics, let's back up a little bit. Hydraulic fluid doesn't compress, and that's why this is a fantastic option for actuating the clutch, and why hydraulics are also a fantastic option for actuating brakes. But if there's air in the system, the air actually will compress. And that's what creates that spongy feeling. And on brakes, because the pressure is so high, that air can constrict quite a bit and be compressed quite a bit. So the reason that the PSI in the hydraulic line on brakes is so high is because if we have disc brakes, we are squeezing a rotor. And when we get to the solid rotor in between, it is a hard stop. And as we apply pressure, the only thing you can do is build the pressure. But on a hydraulic clutch system, we have moving components. This arm is moving. It's pushing against a spring-loaded pressure plate. And because it is actually moving, the pressures don't build up in the hydraulic system. So typical hydraulic pressures are less than 50 psi. So if brakes are more than 200, can be as high as 500 or 1,000, and we're less than 50 psi on a slave cylinder, the same rules don't apply. This will never, ever feel spongy if there's air in the system. In fact, you can bleed one of these and only get half the air out. And it'll feel great. The pedal will feel firm. It won't feel rock hard like brakes feel because, well, there's no positive stop. But it will feel firm. The only way you can tell if all the air is out is to measure the stroke. And that is really, really simple to do. All you have to do is make a mark on the window where the clutch fork lines up, and then have someone press the clutch pedal. And wherever this fork ends up, you make a second mark. Now, you measure that mark, and right now we're sitting at about 3/4 of an inch. And my hydraulic slave and my master cylinder will give you 1 inch right there. And if you're not getting 1 inch, there's air in the system. This measurement is the only way to know if you have gotten all the air out. Now, you would think that this would be a pretty simple thing. Bleeding this would not be that hard. But that is the single biggest challenge that installers have, is getting all this air out. And the reason for that is this transmission is not parallel with the ground. The tail shaft end often slopes down, which means the bleeder is no longer the highest point, because if this is cocked, it's angled down, you can now get a little bit of a bubble up in here, and that will reduce pedal stroke. So, if you're installing a hydraulic clutch and you're not getting the calculated amount of stroke at the slave cylinder, which is fluid volume, I have a whole video on this. You take the fluid volume of the master cylinder and you take the fluid volume of the slave cylinder, and that'll tell you how much stroke you're supposed to be getting. If you are not getting the calculated amount, and there's no leaks, a leak would cause less stroke. But if there's no leaks, you're not getting the calculated amount, then there is air in the system. Plain and simple. Myth number 1, all the air is out. Myth number 2. This applies specifically to Ford T5, 3550, TKO, and TKX transmissions, and it is specific to Ford. I can't speak to the other makes and models that have also run a T5, but for the Ford, this is the myth. I need to have some space between the throwout bearing and the fingers on the clutch. So in other words, if I push this, and you can see that there is some lash there, that it is moving. Now there's a spring inside here. And I've actually had customers, this is kind of like myth 2.5. They'll be like, my clutch is slipping because the spring inside the slave cylinder is causing the throwout bearing to ride up against the pressure plate. No, no, no. This spring does not have even remotely the force required to even begin to engage the pressure plate. So if the pressure caused by the spring is causing your clutch to slip, there's totally something else going on. So this is how you set this up, and this applies to every single one of my kits. You always completely bottom out the push rod so that all lash is removed. The piston is completely down in the bottom of the slave cylinder. And then you simply tighten the nut up and get it to where it is snug. From there, you can come in and tighten up the jam nut to hold it into place. With all lash removed, if you're getting the proper slave cylinder stroke, your clutch should be working. At this point, you can now adjust this to determine exactly where you would like the clutch to grab and let go. The technique that I've found that works best for this is I will park my car on an incline driveway. And we're not talking like a really steep incline. We're talking just a nice gradual driveway that has enough incline for rain to run off of it. And what I do is with the car off and in gear, I slowly begin to press the clutch pedal until the car starts to roll. At the moment that the car starts to roll, I take note of where the clutch pedal is in its stroke, and that tells me the engagement. And I can tighten this or loosen this to adjust where that grabs. Now, you can add between 0, you always start with 0. 0 is the minimum, you have to have all the lash out. But you start with 0 to 1/8 of an inch of preload. Don't ever go with more than 1/8 of an inch of preload. That's the absolute max. Otherwise, you can have clutch slipping issues. But that's all you have to do to get it adjusted. Now, I know what you're thinking. Many of you are like, no, stop, that's wrong. If your throwout bearing is riding up against the pressure plate all the time, you're going to burn up your throwout bearing. And this is the nugget of truth. That thinking is true for old school clutches. Cars in the 60s, those kind of clutches, you wanted that space to prolong the life of your throwout bearing. But on a T5, these were designed to have a cable pass right through this hole. And cables stretch, which means to properly have a cable set up, you need to have this pulled tight, all lash removed, and you actually need to have a little bit of preload on it. Now, all the transmissions that I sell kits for use the same type of throwout bearing. So they are all set up to ride on the pressure plate all the time. Now, with that in mind, not all throwout bearings are created equally. And a cheap auto parts store replacement is probably going to make some noise and is not going to last as long, which means you got to pull the transmission. So I always recommend spend the extra money, get yourself a good Ford Motorsport throwout bearing, and you'll be good to go. So we've debunked the first myth that all the air is out. We've debunked the second myth that there needs to be space between the throwout bearing and the pressure plate. What's the third myth? Well, the third myth, I don't have any visuals for. So you're just going to hear me talking and maybe I'll wave my hand around. All right, I'm going to do the best I can. The third myth that I hear all the time is if I have a 7/8 slave cylinder, then I need a 7/8 master cylinder. And this is internet wisdom. I mean, if you go to forums, if you go to all kinds of pages, they'll say, oh yeah, you want your slave cylinder and your master cylinder to have the exact same bore. And that's not true. It's a myth. What you want to have is the smallest bore master cylinder that you can possibly get that has enough fluid volume to actuate the slave cylinder. Now that's kind of a mouthful. I have a whole video on matching master cylinders and slave cylinders. And what that video basically talks about is calculating fluid volume and using it to determine if you have enough fluid to actuate your slave cylinder. Basically, if you have a master cylinder that has a smaller bore than your slave cylinder, you will have a softer pedal, which is a good thing. Most people going with a hydraulic clutch are doing so because they want reduced pedal effort. So by going with a smaller bore master cylinder, you end up with better pedal feel. The problem is, if that master cylinder does not have sufficient stroke to actuate the slave cylinder, you're going to have reduced travel and your clutch isn't going to work properly. So in the case of the kits that I sell, this is a 7/8 bore slave cylinder. And I've designed this kit so that this works with a 3/4 inch bore master cylinder that has at least 1.25 inches of stroke. Now, I sold a master cylinder like that for years, and it resulted in 0.92 inches of stroke at the slave cylinder. Now, if you look on the internet, you will find that a T5 requires 1 inch of stroke to actuate the clutch. So it sounds to me like 0.92 is going to be insufficient. Well, that measurement is here at the cable hole. My kit utilizes this inner hole, which shortens the total length of the lever and reduces the required stroke to 0.9 inches. So a 3/4 inch bore master cylinder with 1.25 inches of stroke will give you 0.92 inches at the slave, which is enough to actuate the clutch. The problem is, we're going to revert back to myth number one. I would sell this setup with that master cylinder to customers, and they would come back and say, I'm not getting enough stroke, and all the air is out. Because systems like this can be challenging to bleed, I started selling a 13/16 bore master cylinder with a 1.1 inch stroke, which gives you a full inch here at the slave, which is more than we need because we're not using the cable hole. What that allows for is if a customer misses getting a little bit of air, there's a tiny little bubble up here in the front, their clutch is still going to work properly. And so changing to that master cylinder has eliminated a lot of troubleshooting where customers are struggling to get the air out. But in a perfect world, you want to have the 3/4 inch bore master cylinder with the 1.25 inches of stroke because it will make for a softer pedal. That's what I use in my cars. That's what I recommend. But like I said, I had to make a change on what I sold just to make it easier for customers. And that slight increase in bore didn't make the pedal that much stiffer. So you're probably thinking, he's lost sight of what he was talking about. The myth was that you needed a 7/8 bore master to actuate a 7/8 bore slave cylinder. Well, I explained all that information because I wanted to show you that you can actuate this with a smaller master cylinder. And I also wanted to illustrate why it's important to have a smaller master cylinder. Now, this myth that the slave cylinder and master cylinder need to match, let's talk about the nugget of truth. If I have a 7/8 bore slave cylinder and I have a 7/8 bore master cylinder, then I'm probably going to have ample stroke here at the clutch fork. The kit will likely work. And that is why this is such a common statement on the internet, is because it will probably work. You'll probably get the stroke you need, but it comes at the expense of a stiffer pedal. So that's why you always need to calculate, you always need to match your master cylinder and your slave cylinder so that you have the correct ratio between the two to have just enough stroke at the clutch and to minimize pedal effort. I hope that answers some questions, helps you understand why those three things are myths and how to best set up your system. If you've got one of my kits, I'm happy to help you. If you're troubleshooting, you're having issues, feel free to email me, contact me through my website. If you don't have one of my kits, contact me anyway. I help people all the time. I am a car guy first and a business owner second, which means if you've got a hydraulic clutch and you're having issues with it and you've got questions, if I can help you, if I can explain what you need to change or what would make it work better for you, I'm happy to do so. If you have any questions about this video or hydraulic clutches in general, don't hesitate to put them down in the comments and I would love to get back to you. If you would like to buy a system like this, please check out my website, dayscars.com. as I have lots of options for those wanting to install a hydraulic clutch on a variety of transmissions that are Ford application. And when I say Ford application, I mean that the transmission was designed to go into a Ford. I sell kits to guys that have put them in BMWs and Miatas and all kinds of things. But in all those cases, they're using a factory Ford bell housing, the Ford style T5 or other transmission. And more often than not, it's tied to a 302 or 351.
If you like what you've seen, please click like. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe. Thanks for watching.